The morning sun cast long shadows across the precinct parking lot as Officer Richard Thompson adjusted his badge, ready for another day of patrol. 23 years on the force had given him an air of authority that he wore like armor. What he didn't know was that this ordinary Tuesday would become the day that would challenge everything he thought he knew about power, prejudice, and his own deeply held beliefs. It started with a black Mercedes S-Class parked in the restricted section of City Hall. Thompson had seen these situations 100 times before, entitled civilians thinking the rules didn't apply to them. As he approached the vehicle, he noticed a tall man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit stepping out, phone pressed to his ear, deep in conversation. "Sir, you can't park here," Thompson called out, his voice carrying that familiar authoritative edge. The man held up one finger, signaling for a moment as he finished his call. This simple gesture made Thompson's face flush with anger. In his mind, this was yet another display of disrespect toward law enforcement. "I don't care who you're talking to." Thompson raised his voice, moving closer. "This is a restricted area. I'm going to need to see your ID." The man calmly ended his call and reached for his wallet, maintaining a composed demeanor that somehow irritated Thompson even more. But before the man could retrieve his identification, Thompson's assumptions took over. "Let me guess, you think you're above the law. Think you can just park wherever you want because you're driving a fancy car." His words carried years of unchecked biases, each one revealing more about himself than the man he was confronting. The gathering crowd of City Hall employees and morning visitors created an uncomfortable audience. Some pulled out their phones, sensing the situation was about to become another viral moment of confrontation between law enforcement and a person of color. What happened next would be shared thousands of times across social media platforms. The man in the suit slowly opened his wallet, but instead of pulling out a driver's license, he removed a different form of identification. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he'd choreographed this moment. "Officer Thompson," he began, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made everyone lean in slightly. "I'm actually glad we're meeting like this, though I had hoped to make the announcement at this morning's staff meeting." He held up the badge that made Thompson's eyes widen and his throat go dry. The crowd watched as realization dawned on Thompson's face. The man he'd been lecturing, the one he profiled and prejudged, was standing there with the credentials of their city's newly appointed police chief, the same position Thompson had been passed over for just 3 weeks ago. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The new chief's next words would determine not just Thompson's future on the force, but potentially the direction of the entire department's approach to community relations. As phone cameras continued recording, the chief took a step forward, and the story of what happened next would become a turning point for the department, the city, and most importantly, for Officer Thompson himself. But sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most uncomfortable moments, and this was about to become one of those defining instances where everything changes in ways no one could have predicted. Chief Michael Harrison's words cut through the tense silence like a laser. "Why don't we continue this conversation in my office, Officer Thompson?" His tone was professional, betraying neither anger nor satisfaction. The gathered crowd watched as both men walked into City Hall, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Thompson's mind raced through his years of service, the countless traffic stops, the snap judgments, the moments he convinced himself were just good policing. Each step toward the chief's office felt heavier than the last. The same office he'd pictured himself occupying just months ago, before being passed over for promotion. Inside, Chief Harrison didn't take a seat behind the impressive oak desk. Instead, he chose one of the chairs facing it, gesturing for Thompson to do the same. This subtle rejection of the power dynamic didn't go unnoticed. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, illuminating floating dust particles between them. "You know, Officer Thompson, I spent 15 years in Atlanta before this," Harrison began, loosening his tie slightly. "Made detective, then captain. Worked my way up, just like you. But every single day, even in uniform, I got stopped by fellow officers who couldn't believe I was one of them." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The difference is, I turned those moments into fuel for change. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. The chief's words were hitting close to home, forcing him to confront memories he'd rather forget. Like the time he'd stopped that young doctor rushing to an emergency, or the professor he'd questioned for looking suspicious while walking in his own upscale neighborhood. "I've read your file, Thompson," Harrison continued, pulling out a thick folder. 23 years of service, commendations for bravery, letters of appreciation from the community. He spread out several documents on the coffee table between them. But there's something else here, too, a pattern that's becoming harder to ignore. Outside the office, the day's activities continued as usual, but inside, time seemed to stand still. Through the glass walls, other officers and staff tried to steal glances without being obvious. The story of what happened in the parking lot was already spreading through the building like wildfire. "Here's what puzzles me." Harrison leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Your early years show a different officer. Your community engagement scores were top-notch. Kids in the neighborhood knew you by name. What changed, Thompson?" The question hung in the air like heavy smoke. Thompson opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time in years, he found himself without a ready defense. The chief's words had somehow bypassed his usual walls of justification and rationalization. Harrison stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city they both had sworn to protect. "I'm not here to fire you, Thompson. That would be easy, wouldn't it? Just another reason for you to hold onto those beliefs." He turned back, his expression thoughtful. "No, I have something else in mind. Something that might remind you of the officer you used to be." The tension in the room shifted slightly, like a weight being redistributed rather than lifted. Thompson found himself holding his breath, waiting for what would come next. Whatever the chief was about to propose would either be his redemption or his ultimate challenge. As Harrison reached for a different folder on his desk, a knock at the door interrupted them. The chief's secretary poked her head in, her expression urgent. "Sir, there's a situation downtown that requires immediate attention." She paused, looking between the two men. "Both of you might want to see this." The downtown situation turned out to be a hostage crisis at First National Bank. As Chief Harrison and Officer Thompson arrived at the scene, the bitter irony wasn't lost on either of them. Just 3 hours ago, they'd been locked in a tense confrontation over prejudice and power. Now, they were forced to work together to save lives. The bank's glass front offered a clear view of the unfolding drama inside. 2 armed suspects had taken control of the main floor, with at least 15 civilians trapped inside. SWAT teams were already in position, their black vehicles forming a protective perimeter around the building. The morning sun reflected off their tactical gear, creating an almost surreal scene. "I know that teller," Thompson said quietly, recognizing the elderly woman trying to comfort a crying child near the counter. "Mrs. Chen. She's handled my deposits for years." His voice carried a hint of the community connection Chief Harrison had mentioned earlier, a glimpse of the officer he used to be. Harrison studied the situation, his years of experience evident in his calm demeanor. "The suspects are nervous. Look at their movement patterns. They're not professionals." He turned to Thompson. "You said you know some of these people. Tell me more about them." As Thompson began describing the regular bank customers he recognized, something shifted in his perspective. These weren't just faces in a crowd anymore. Each person had a story, a family, a life that mattered. It was the same kind of individual recognition he'd failed to give the chief earlier that morning. The situation grew more tense when one of the suspects started showing signs of increasing agitation. Through their negotiator's phone line, they could hear his demands becoming more erratic. The chief's phone buzzed with a text message. SWAT was ready to breach, waiting for his command. But Harrison hesitated, his eyes fixed on something only he seemed to notice. "Thompson," he said, his voice low and measured, "look at the younger suspect's left hand. What do you see?" Thompson squinted, years of street experience kicking in. The suspect's hand was shaking, but not from nerves. The movement was rhythmic, almost predictable. Diabetic tremors, he realized. He needs insulin. A plan began forming in Harrison's mind. You said you know these people, Thompson. They know you. Before today's incident, you were part of this community. He turned to face his officer directly. I'm giving you a choice. SWAT can breach, or you can go in there and remind everyone, including yourself, why you became a cop in the first place. The weight of the moment pressed down on Thompson's shoulders. Through the glass, he could see Mrs. Chen still comforting the child, her own fear hidden behind a brave smile. He thought about all the times she'd asked about his daughter, remembered his coffee order, treated him like a person first and a uniform second. The radio crackled with SWAT's final warning. They needed a decision now. Chief Harrison stood silently, letting Thompson wrestle with more than just tactical options. This was about redemption, about choosing between the officer he'd become and the one he could be again. Thompson took a deep breath and removed his tactical vest, much to the surprise of nearby officers. If I'm going in there, he said, looking at the chief, they need to see me as someone they can trust, not another threat. He began walking toward the bank's entrance, his badge catching the morning light. Behind him, he heard Harrison call out one last time. What the chief said next would change everything. But first, Thompson had to face the consequences of his own choices, both past and present. Thompson, Harrison called out, his voice carrying across the tension-filled street. The younger suspect, he's my nephew. The revelation hit Thompson like a physical blow, stopping him mid-stride. Suddenly, the chief's earlier hesitation about the SWAT breach made perfect sense. This wasn't just about Thompson's redemption anymore. It was about Harrison's family. The young man inside, Thompson could now see, shared the chief's high cheekbones and strong jaw. But while Harrison carried himself with dignified authority, his nephew's posture screamed desperation. The family resemblance was there, buried beneath layers of fear and poor choices. As Thompson pushed through the bank's glass doors, hands raised, he felt the weight of both his morning confrontation with Harrison and this new revelation pressing down on him. The air inside was thick with tension and the artificial chill of overworked air conditioning. My name is Officer Thompson, he announced, his voice steady despite his racing heart. I'm here to talk. Mrs. Chen's eyes lit with recognition, but her expression carried a mix of hope and uncertainty. The same look she'd given him when he'd gradually become more distant, more suspicious of everyone over the years. The crying child beside her had finally quieted, watching the scene unfold with wide, innocent eyes. Stay back, the older suspect shouted, his gun hand shaking. But the younger man, Harrison's nephew, was focused on his trembling left hand, trying to hide the worsening diabetic symptoms. Thompson could see the sweat beading on his forehead, the pallor of his skin suggesting his blood sugar was dropping to dangerous levels. I know you're scared, Thompson said, directing his words to the younger man. And I know you need help. He slowly reached into his pocket, drawing alarmed looks from both suspects. I'm just getting this, he continued, pulling out a small wrapped candy, something he'd carried ever since his rookie partner had been diabetic. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. Through the glass, Thompson could see Harrison watching, his usual composed demeanor cracking slightly at the sight of his nephew's deteriorating condition. The older suspect's gun wavered between Thompson and the hostages, his desperation making him more unpredictable. But before Thompson could take another step, Mrs. Chen suddenly spoke up in her gentle voice. Officer Thompson, she said, remember when you first started coming to this bank? You used to bring your daughter with you every Friday. Her words carried no judgment, just a reminder of who he'd been, who he could be again. The mention of his daughter hit Thompson hard, especially as he looked at Harrison's nephew. How many times had he prejudged young men like him, never considering their full stories, their families, their struggles? The morning's confrontation with Harrison now felt like a mirror, reflecting back years of unconscious biases and missed opportunities for understanding. Suddenly, the older suspect's phone rang, the negotiator calling back. But as he reached to answer it, his partner swayed dangerously, the diabetic episode reaching a critical point. In that split second, Thompson had to make a choice that would either vindicate Harrison's faith in him or prove that his earlier prejudices ran too deep to overcome. The next few moments would test everything: Thompson's training, his character, and his capacity for change. As Harrison's nephew began to collapse, the older suspect's finger tightened on the trigger, and Mrs. Chen moved to protect the child beside her. The situation teetered on the edge of disaster or redemption. Thompson's instincts kicked in as Harrison's nephew began to fall. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, catching the young man before he hit the ground. The older suspect, startled by the sudden movement, fired a shot that shattered the silence. The bullet missed Thompson by inches, embedding itself in a nearby wall as screams erupted throughout the bank. In that chaotic moment, Mrs. Chen displayed unexpected courage. She used the distraction to knock over a nearby cart of deposit slips, sending papers flying through the air. The older suspect, momentarily blinded by the fluttering papers, lost his focus just long enough for two hidden off-duty officers, regular bank customers Thompson had failed to notice, to tackle him from behind. As the gun clattered to the floor, Thompson was already administering the glucose tablet to Harrison's nephew, supporting his head while checking his vitals. "Stay with me, son," he urged, his voice carrying the same concern he'd have shown his own child. The young man's eyes flickered with recognition, fear, and shame all at once. "I didn't want to," the nephew whispered, his voice weak. "He said he'd hurt my mom, the chief's sister, if I didn't help him." The revelation struck Thompson hard. This wasn't just a simple bank robbery. It was a complex web of extortion and family ties that he'd almost judged too quickly, just like he'd done with Harrison that morning. Outside, SWAT teams were rushing in, securing the scene as hostages were safely evacuated. Chief Harrison entered last, moving quickly to his nephew's side. But before reaching him, he stopped at Mrs. Chen's desk, checking on her and the child she protected. It was a small gesture that spoke volumes about his leadership style. Everyone mattered equally. As paramedics worked to stabilize the nephew, he grabbed Thompson's arm. "The other guy," he said urgently, "he's got more people. This wasn't just about the money. There are others like me being forced." His voice trailed off as the medical team took over, but the message was clear. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a larger investigation. Harrison looked at Thompson, their earlier confrontation transformed by the morning's events. "Looks like we both made some assumptions today," the chief said, extending his hand. "Ready to help me clean up my family mess, Officer Thompson." But before Thompson could respond, Mrs. Chen approached them, still comforting the child whose parents had finally arrived. She looked at Thompson with knowing eyes. "You know, officer," she said softly, "sometimes it takes losing our way to find a better path." She turned to Chief Harrison. "And sometimes it takes a stranger to help us see our own blind spots." As the chaos settled and the bank lobby cleared, Thompson watched Harrison comfort his sister who had just arrived, saw the family dynamic he'd failed to consider in his earlier prejudgment. The morning had begun with one officer's biased assumptions and ended with a reminder that every person's story ran deeper than surface judgments. Looking down at his badge, Thompson realized that true law enforcement wasn't about power or authority. It was about understanding, protection, and service to all members of the community, regardless of appearance or circumstance. As he joined Harrison for the debriefing, he knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges in the ongoing investigation, but today had taught him lessons no police academy could ever provide. The rising evening sun cast long shadows through the bank's windows, symbolically marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Sometimes, Thompson realized, the biggest threats to justice weren't the criminals they chased, but the prejudices they carried within themselves. In the weeks that followed, Thompson and Harrison worked side by side, unraveling the extortion ring that had forced countless others like the chief's nephew into criminal acts. Each new discovery reinforced the morning's lesson about looking beyond surface judgments. The investigation revealed victims from every walk of life: business owners, students, and professionals who'd been trapped by circumstances rather than criminal intent. Mrs. Chen became a regular visitor to the precinct, bringing her famous homemade cookies and wisdom in equal measure. She'd stop by Thompson's desk, sharing stories about the community members who'd noticed the positive changes in his approach. The suspicious glances had been replaced by genuine interest in people's lives, and the community responded in kind. Harrison's nephew, after recovering, became an unexpected ally in their investigation. His testimony helped identify key players in the extortion ring, and his courage in coming forward inspired other victims to do the same. Thompson found himself admiring the young man's resilience, seeing in him the strength of character that ran in his uncle's family. One morning, exactly a month after the bank incident, Thompson arrived at work to find a small gathering in the briefing room. Chief Harrison stood at the front, but instead of his usual spot at the podium, he was sitting on the edge of a desk, creating an atmosphere of equality rather than authority. "Officer Thompson," he began, "would you share with our newer officers what you've learned this past month?" Thompson looked around the room, seeing faces both familiar and new. He thought carefully before speaking. "I spent 23 years thinking I was doing good police work," he said, his voice carrying quiet conviction. "But I was looking without really seeing. True police work isn't about power or control. It's about understanding and protecting everyone in our community, especially those we might be quick to judge." The chief nodded, adding, "Sometimes the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes. This department is changing because each of us is willing to change." He glanced at Thompson with respect that had been earned, not demanded. Later that afternoon, Thompson sat at his desk, reviewing case files when a familiar face appeared, the young child from the bank, holding his mother's hand. "Officer Thompson." The child beamed, holding up a drawing. "I made this for you." The crayon artwork showed a police officer helping people of different colors, standing together under a bright sun. As Thompson pinned the drawing to his bulletin board, he noticed Chief Harrison watching from his office, a knowing smile on his face. The morning that had started with prejudice and confrontation had set in motion changes neither of them could have predicted. The precinct was transforming, becoming a place where community trust was built on understanding rather than authority. Mrs. Chen's words from that day still echoed in his mind. "Sometimes it takes losing our way to find a better path." Thompson realized that his confrontation with Harrison hadn't just changed him. It had created ripples throughout the department, touching lives in ways he was only beginning to understand. As the sun set on another day of service, Thompson looked at the child's drawing one more time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between judgment and understanding. But now he knew that true strength in law enforcement came not from power over others, but from the power to change oneself. Outside his window, he could see Harrison leaving for the day, stopping to chat with community members as he walked to his car. The same black Mercedes that had sparked their confrontation now represented something different. A reminder that every ending could be a new beginning, if only we're brave enough to learn from our mistakes and choose a better path forward.